Lycoris Recoil is a great show. It's got fantastic characters put in entertaining and emotional scenarios set in a well-realized alternate near-future world. But as I took in the story, I couldn't help but start to find parallels between it and a slightly older favorite of mine, Psycho-Pass. Just as a fair warning, I'm going to spoil these and any other shows I end up mentioning in this video. While I initially only saw vague similarities between the villains of each show, Makishima and Majima, as I thought about their roles in their respective stories, I continued to notice an increasing number of recurring ideas. Both series focus on a central conflict, where a terrorist with oddly colored hair is opposed by an incredibly capable hero that embodies a fundamentally clashing worldview, which eventually leads to a tower-top confrontation between the two. But that also describes The Dark Knight, so clearly this alone isn't specific enough to argue the existence of a unique thread of influence between these two particular series. As I continued to compare and contrast these two shows, I not only came to the conclusion that yes, Lycoris Recoil was likely influenced in part by Psycho-Pass, but also that it takes broadly from elements prevalent in anime as a whole. In spite of that, I wouldn't call it derivative at all. In fact, the way Lycoris Recoil takes inspiration from what came before to create something that feels distinct is not only one of the keys to its greatness, but also gets at the core of the different ways anime influences itself. It's easy to point out more parallels between Lycoris Recoil and Psycho-Pass. They both focus on a pair of dual protagonists, one a veteran and one that's less experienced, who grow fond of each other over time. In both series, Takina and Akane eventually do everything in their power to protect Chisato and Kogami respectively from the unfortunate circumstances laid out for them, and in both, the villains' plans include sowing chaos by giving others the means to enact violence, whether through guns or technology. They even have thematic parallels. Both stories are set in a version of Japan with residents that enjoy a peaceful, prosperous existence built on the foundation of a lie, one that, if revealed, would tear that society apart. Because of this, both series become an exploration of the concept of whether the ends justify the means, specifically in a context where the vast majority of people will be able to benefit in ignorance of the unethicality of those means. The interesting thing about these two shows, though, is despite all of these parallels, they watch extremely differently. Psycho-Pass is fantastic, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't get a little dry at points. It's a continuous stream of philosophical musings on the implications of a post-scarcity, post-stress society on humanity. The story is great, but it can be bogged down sometimes by the loftiness with which it approaches its own ideas. Urobuchi Gen's script is frankly self-indulgent, with characters often discussing their perspectives through direct quotes of fiction and philosophy, rather than talking like, human beings. Lycoris Recoil, in comparison, infuses much more levity into the entire experience. The show has enough meaning imbued into the plot to not feel vapid, but at the same time, it allows for plenty of lightheartedness amidst the more serious moments. The characters have great chemistry, the plot moves at a brisk pace, and is filled with plenty of ridiculous action movie set pieces. While it may mirror many aspects of Psycho-Pass, it's not beholden to the same approach and tone as that show. It generally has a more hopeful take on many of the ideas the two share. Lycoris Recoil isn't the first show I've seen that's evoked shades of Psycho-Pass, though. It Invaded also seems inspired by it, in many ways more so. Like Psycho-Pass, it also focuses on a police force that uses a handheld device to mentally analyze criminals. Unlike Psycho-Pass's dominators, though, the Wakumusubi is instead used to pick up the particles left behind by killers after the crime is committed, somewhat changing their role in the story. They don't really have an associated moral quandary, they're just a tool to be used without question. but this is in line with It Invaded's attitude as a whole. It has no time to ponder the consequences of the existence of this technology on society. It needs every second it has for all the other ideas it's constantly throwing out. Most of the plot feels like an excuse to show off flashy concepts or a clever puzzle box in one of the id wells the series revolves around. And while there are other parallels with Psycho Pass, like the focal characters including a young but experienced cop that's fallen from grace, and a barely out of school, fresh-faced newbie girl cop, it doesn't maintain much of the depth of that series. It's hard to say if the similarities these shows share with Psycho Pass are intentional. I wouldn't be surprised if either Asaura and Spider Lily or Maijo Taro simply unconsciously incorporated elements of a story that they enjoyed in the past. But regardless of why, both series appear to be influenced by Psycho Pass in a generally traditional way, where plot points of prior stories are reincorporated into a new narrative. It Invaded just unfortunately weaves a more disjointed story that fails to make me as engaged with the characters or themes. Lycoris Recoil is much more effective in repurposing its borrowed ideas into something cohesive. But this traditional influence is only one part of what makes Lycoris Recoil succeed. The other is how it effectively merges that influence with ideas it plucks from the existing pool of recurring elements that have become entrenched in anime over time. In comparison to Psycho Pass, Lycoris Recoil feels much more anime-ish, if that makes sense. It has more aspects that embody ideas that, to me at least, have become synonymous with anime and manga. It's these additions that help it establish a very different feel and appeal from its predecessor. But while pointing out some of these elements is easy, trying to explain how they become a draw for the series is a little more difficult. In my opinion, the easiest way to understand this appeal is approaching it through the lens of the theory of database consumption. This concept was presented by the cultural critic Azuma Hiroki in his book Otaku, Japan's Database Animals. First released as 動物化する postmodern オタクから見た日本社会. In 2001, Database Animals is a philosophical critique of otaku and the works they enjoy through a postmodern lens. Which is to say, trying to parse any meaning out of it, even in English, makes my head hurt. But one thing that stuck with me from this book was the concept of database consumption. The idea that people have come to consume works not as an opening into a particular setting, worldview, or societal narrative, but instead as a combination of different elements in a collective metaphorical database of established cultural concepts. And Azuma posits that anime, manga, games, and the otaku culture surrounding them are a perfect example of this in action. It's pretty easy to find this in play at multiple levels in most anime without trying all that hard. Looking at character traits, there are recurring elements like blue hair, twin tails, or ahoge. At a character archetype level, there's the audience stand-in, tsundere, gyaru, and genki girls. And at a genre and story level, there are mecha, harem, isekai, magical girl, etc. Of course, you can break down any work, anime or otherwise, in a similar way. Database Animals doesn't argue that otaku are the only ones that consume media this way. Database consumption is applicable to all postmodern media. What makes otaku stand out as a perfect example of this is the fervor with which they treat these recurring aspects. Azuma calls these otaku database entries moe elements, and while moe may not be as much of a buzzword as it was when the book was written, that accurately describes the obsession with which these components are treated. Just look at the many real online databases that analyze, categorize, and store the traits of characters and series to see this in action. While I don't think Lycoris Recoil plays into this as much as some other shows, I actually do think it uses it in a very effective way. Psycho Pass is an intellectually intriguing thriller that sucks you into its well-realized world. But one thing I wouldn't call it is fun. And sometimes I just like a bit of absurd goofiness in my anime. Lycoris Recoil maintains a significant amount of that intellectual satisfaction, while also appealing more to my base otaku interests by adding database elements that I enjoy. Of course, it puts a heavy amount of focus on its two female leads, which combined with a surprising amount of slice of life scenes for an action series lended a lot of the same draw as cute girl shows. Seeing the day-to-day at Cafe Lycoris gives it a similar feeling to workplace shows like Shirobako or Sakura Quest. And the focus on high school girl assassins reminds me of other shows with underage undercover operatives, particularly Princess Principal. That's not to mention the many well-established character archetypes: the Genki girl, the cool-headed, expressionless girl, the not quite 30-year-old woman that's already a spinster, and the child that may not actually be a child. This may beg the question, what is actually different between the connections I drew between Lycoris Recoil and Psycho Pass, and the ones I've drawn here between Lycoris Recoil and other series that contain similar database elements? I would argue it's mostly a distinction of the specificity of the elements that are shared in each case. The parallels with Psycho Pass are more direct. They share very particular aspects of the plot and themes. Psycho Pass didn't invent these plot elements. It's hard to find any work with truly original ideas nowadays. Something has done almost every concept before, but many of these ideas, especially when combined in the way they are, feel more uniquely tied to Psycho Pass than they are commonly recurring narrative concepts, at least as far as anime goes. If they were more broadly and frequently used, they could also become entrenched otaku database elements, but as they are, they're more associated with a select few works. For this reason, I tend to think of their appearance in Lycoris Recoil as more of a direct chain of influence. The elements that appeal to otaku on a database level are more disassociated from their origin point. For example, while I would hesitate to call Ayanamide from Neon Genesis Evangelion a kudere, her emotionless, expressionless demeanor would be incorporated into countless characters that would help establish that archetype as its own separate recognizable concept, one that isn't tethered to Rei or that series. So Lycoris Recoil feels influenced by Psycho Pass through the ideas that they share. But while it also shares a lot of database elements with other series, it feels less influenced by them and more like it taps into the same pre-existing concepts that those series do, giving them similar appeals. It's these dual methods of taking influence that make Lycoris Recoil appeal to me in the specific way it does. It evokes some of the thematic meaning of Psycho Pass thanks to their shared ideas, mixes in some new ones of its own, and tops it off with some otaku database elements. Combine that with strong writing, great performances, and generally solid production values, and you get a standout show. But the existence of these database elements is not always of benefit to anime. By incentivizing creators to dip into the same well of ideas, database consumption can frequently lead to works being derivative. Look at isekai, for example. Most of these series draw from a relatively small pool of recurring established ideas, worlds that use video game logic, harems of fantasy girls, ridiculously overpowered self-insert heroes, the idea of redoing life but better this time. There are a lot of tropes that these shows reuse that frequently play into the wish fulfillment appeal that many of them aim to evoke. But because they can also use other database elements to appeal in a different way, they may be able to find an audience regardless of how uninteresting the actual story may be. Maybe someone generally enjoys isekai but is really into cat girls and long dark hair. They may find How Not to Summon a Demon Lord to be interesting, and they wouldn't even have to watch the show to be captured by those appeal points. I know I sure haven't. I just got that from a teaser image. I have zero intention of watching this show. That's not to say How Not to Summon a Demon Lord couldn't be good, with rich characters and a deep story. I doubt it, but it's possible. The thing is though, that doesn't necessarily matter for someone who responds strongly to the moe elements contained in that show. It's for the same reason that gacha games have characters with every combination of physical traits, body type, personality, and additional fetishistic appeals. Someone is going to love one of those characters enough to spend their life savings unlocking them. No matter the medium, otaku are drawn in by specific database elements, and that can be a crutch for subpar works to find success. It's this trap that Lycoris Recoil avoids. It's not just an attempt to take the ideas of Psycho Pass and find a new audience by changing up the moe elements. First of all, like I've said, I don't really know if these similarities were intentional in the first place, and second, the series isn't carried by the character designs or plot concepts. Those instead help prop up a simply, well put together story, one that does more than enough to make the show feel fresh and original. That's not always the case though. And while noticing the similarities between Lycoris Recoil and Psycho Pass, I was reminded of my first time watching another show. Yuuki Yuuna is a hero. This anime is a perfect example of the issues tied to database consumption. Tell me if you've heard this one before. Yuuki Yuuna is about 5 middle school students with the power to transform into magical girls that are repeatedly transported into a bizarre alternate dimension where they battle unearthly monsters. Eventually, they realize that their ability to fight comes at a high price, and the emotional fallback from that realization recontextualizes each of their individual worldviews, leading rifts to start forming between them. While they struggle not to fall into despair, they continue to do their best to push through the difficulties they face to defend the ones they care about. Sound familiar? It's just Madoka Magica. Okay. There are differences, but making the source of their power gods and their guidance a religious order isn't exactly reinventing the wheel here. Much more than Lycoris Recoil, or It Invaded even, Yuuki Yuuna feels like it doesn't have much of an identity outside of what it plucks directly from another series. I'm not even the biggest fan of Madoka Magica. I honestly find the beginning way too slow, and it only gets really good for me about 2/3 of the way in. Outside of Mommy's death, the remaining first few twists weren't that impactful for me either. But the main series finishes up pretty great, and Rebellion is fantastic. So I'm actually really excited for the upcoming 4th film. Yuuki Yuuna as a hero though fails to replicate the interesting aspects of Madoka Magica, but apes off of it in multiple ways. Even when they lead up to the twist that their abilities cost them the use of their bodies, the show makes it obvious what's happening before it's fully revealed, but seems to still expect you to be shocked. And the big emotional payoff that follows is so trite it's kind of insulting. At the end of the day, my question becomes, what makes Yuuki Yuuna as a hero worth watching? This show is so similar to Madoka Magica, and it falls flat in so many ways that I'm not sure what its appeal is supposed to be. You could say it brings a new twist on the ideas that Madoka Magica presented through its more hopeful ending. I would instead argue that it's just toothless. It diffuses the meaning of its already mostly ineffectual dark twists and turns by just undoing them in the end, for seemingly no particular reason. The one great part of this show is the soundtrack, courtesy of Okabe Keiichi's Monaka music production studio. But even that is kind of reminiscent of Kajiura Yuki's also fantastic Madoka soundtrack. Both make use of airy background vocals, ethereal instrumentation, and other recurring ideas to create an unsettling tone. Other than that though, there's no aspect where I would say Yuuki Yuuna rivals Madoka. The designs are less interesting, the writing is weak, and the characters are dull and flat. Madoka Magica holds more emotional weight in episode 10 alone than Yuuki Yuuna musters throughout its entire runtime. Even if you were to disregard the looming shadow of this series that it's so similar to, Yuuki Yuuna just isn't good enough to be worth recommending. So what's left? Well, database consumption. For some people, either the basic elements that make up Madoka are so absorbing that this show also holds that same appeal, despite being worse in almost every category, or something about the specific combination of the elements that make up Yuuki Yuuna triggers a strong response for them. If you've ever wanted to see a twin-tailed blonde Onesan character wield a sword taller than she is, I mean, it's here, I guess. Yuuki Yuuna doesn't have to significantly differentiate itself from Madoka Magica, or bring unique concepts to the table, or be a quality show. It just has to mix up the ideas that are there enough to possibly capture an audience of viewers for which those adjustments ignites a feeling of moe. And at the end of the day, I am one of those potential viewers. The database aspect of anime can cause problems, but it's also part of the appeal. I love anime. I want to see cool fights, I want to see transformations, I want to see cute girls. These elements are part of what I love about these shows. The origins of the term moe are somewhat debated, but I've always liked the idea that it comes from moeru, the Japanese for to burn. That interpretation makes it a perfectly apt description for Azuma to use to describe these anime database entries. Seeing the things I enjoy makes me feel blazingly passionate. Many series I love have reverence for past ideas, but bring them new significance, like Monogatari, Gurren Lagann, or Symphogear. And so, while we may sometimes get series like Yuuki Yuuna as a hero that feel almost as if they're cynically trying to capitalize on these feelings, other times we get shows like Lycoris Recoil that share some parallels with Psycho-Pass but infuses those with girls with guns elements, high school assassins, cute girl shows, and more. These broad concepts are skillfully woven into a show that appeals on multiple levels, something that both the casual viewer and hardcore otaku can enjoy and engage with in the ways they find the most interesting. That's something to be celebrated, and something I think anime could use a bit more of.